Hello. I'd like to talk about something concerning trauma, particularly from childhood issues. And so I'm going to entitle this talk, Why So Few Can Overcome Trauma. Well, first of all, what about this topic of child abuse? There's talks, say, of the common types, such as sexual abuse or physical abuse or neglect. But then, if someone were to say, I was abused in my childhood by such and such an incident, one of these three big ones, so to speak, well, then the next response to certain people might be, well, why can't you get over it? And why do you still keep calling yourself a victim? Why do you keep claiming the victim card, so to speak? And while I think this is a valid criticism of a sort, I think it is missing the point. And that is, whoever told so-and-so that they were victimized in the beginning to begin with? Now, for instance, let's say a child was repeatedly hit and, say, kicked down the stairs a couple times, and they end up in the hospital with multiple broken bones on several occasions, and x-rays corroborate this. Or let's say they have welts all over their back and other areas of their body from being administered the strap, so to speak, or other instruments. Well, I suppose then the claim being that nobody can deny that they were victimized, and furthermore that there's no genetic component involved. That, in other words, the trauma incurred was totally not their fault, and so therefore there's no question that they're a victim. And I would say under such circumstances, these people can sometimes move on the best with that kind of trauma, childhood trauma. But then here's where it gets dicey, I think. For most all therapists and psychiatrists, I say in America anyway, would say that to any amount of human suffering, there's both a genetic and environmental cause. And so the claim would be then that unless there's clear signs of multiple broken bones showing on an x-ray, that there must be, say, a genetic component involved too. But then who is then to say who is a victim and who is not, versus it being a matter of how you're interpreting it, so to speak, cognitively, or a matter of genetics, say. So at this point, I'm reminded of a movie we may have seen in the past, Good Will Hunting, a story of an abused boy, teenager, played by Matt Damon. And at one point in time, he is required, in order to hold his job any further, to see a therapist. And he sees several before settling upon one who is portrayed by Robin Williams. And they get nowhere for a time until one session, Robin Williams tells Matt Damon that it wasn't your fault. There being clear-cut signs of physical abuse, let's say, in medical records, in the movie anyway. And Robin Williams repeats this phrase about 5 times minimum, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Now, Matt Damon originally keeps sloughing off this comment, but by the 5th or 6th time he's getting very rattled and eventually starts breaking down and sobbing, in fact. And this then is the change point in my book, when he realizes he's a victim. And that it wasn't his fault, and that maybe soon thereafter he could even move on, put it in the past, and apply the concept, say, of forgiveness to the source of this, his father namely, or stepfather, whoever. But what if a therapist had said to Matt Damon that, yes, you had multiple broken bones and welts, perhaps, if there were broken bones portrayed in this movie, but at any rate, what if the therapist said, yes, you've had massive trauma, and it shows in medical records at the hospitals, but it's not totally your father or stepfather's fault, because you may have a genetic component that is making you oversensitive, and maybe you're just being a wuss or a wimp and overblowing this whole thing. And so maybe you're not a victim at all. Maybe it's very questionable. And at this point, then, the person in much emotional suffering would not know how to appraise what had happened to him or her. And, of course, as far as seeking any redress in the court, it would be very, very problematic, because if he were to sue the parent or step-parent, the response in return might be that the child is simply oversensitive and overreacting to my having disciplined the child, and that a, quote, robust, healthy child would never have reacted with trauma, symptoms, or emotional distress to begin with. But perhaps you can get an inkling then of where this could lead. Oh, let's say sexual abuse then. Well, let's say a woman reports to the police or some other authorities that she had been abused sexually, and it perhaps is ongoing now by her parents, say when she's a teenager. Well, who is not to come back in a court of law and say that, yes, the child is experiencing symptoms of distress, and maybe even there is some kind of sexual abuse going on, but somebody in court could say that she's simply oversensitive and overreacting, even to the point that if this gal then committed suicide as a result, a court of law could well find, under influence of certain lawyers, say, that the child committed suicide because they were oversensitive by genetic reasons. You could even say that they had a biochemical disposition to be oversensitive, to overreact, and that was the proximate cause of their committing suicide, not the parent. And so the parent is off the hook. Yet another example comes from the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder as applied, say, in part to soldiers returning from the battlefield. Now, the general discussion is that many practitioners don't know why some soldiers return with PTSD, suffering emotional distress, say, of a massive nature, and other soldiers come back having been under great fire and perhaps wounded, but emotionally untouched, rather. And so then, it being quite possible that the soldier could be denied benefits for disability at a minimum, these benefits being quite trivial, I might add, compared to the damage they incurred emotionally. But at any rate, the soldier could well be accused of simply being oversensitive, frail-minded, so to speak, taking it too seriously, being a worrywart, maybe being deemed obsessive-compulsive, or a little paranoid, say, and thus nobody wanting to accord this soldier the status of having been a victim, let's say a victim of PTSD, of trauma, and that it's all basically either completely in their head, or that there's a strong or significant genetic component that makes them oversensitive. And thus, who is to say, including the soldier to himself or any trauma victim, whether they're a victim or not, leaving them confused perhaps for the rest of their lives, even to the extent of wondering who the enemy combatant was or who their parent was at all, especially if the parent maintains they were highly loving and that they were simply administering a spanking or disciplinary action in love. Who's to say then whether the parent did this out of love or in an act of rage, and impulsive rage even? It's one person's word against another. I would finally bring up the example of today's Native American Indians, who everybody knows have a significant amount of alcoholic related troubles in their lives, called alcoholics, for lack of a better word. And at any rate, the leading thought in psychiatric circles is that there's a genetic component to their alcoholism, along with, it is acknowledged, trauma from having gotten, say, a raw deal, herded into reservations, and often dying beforehand, say the Trail of Tears with the Cherokee Indians. And so the Indians are left then scratching their heads, wondering, am I a victim or not? Because they don't know how much of a genetic component is involved. And that would lead then to the next question I have, and it's a serious one. The question being that when it comes to trauma, psychiatry does not assign partial recompense or compensation financially and otherwise to something partly due to trauma and partly genetic, it is said. And this is contrary, I would say, to injuries received from other sources than parents or certain elements in society or foreign powers like on a battlefield. Now, I know this from experience in my family, whereby, let's say, a person is in an auto accident. Oftentimes, I would say there is no clear-cut determination made by an insurance adjuster that it was one person's fault totally and the other person having no fault. Instead, oftentimes there's a apportioned fault given, say one party being 80% at fault and the other 20% at fault. Now, does that mean then that the person 80% at fault gets off the hook? Because it could be said that there were extenuating circumstances. Say, when it comes to childhood issues, that there were extenuating circumstances of genetics or, quote, biochemical disorderedness or oversensitivity then, as coming from such perhaps. Now, the auto adjuster would say that the person 80% at fault is going to have to pay 80% damages instead of 100% damages. But when it comes to child abuse then, that is not extremely clear-cut, like with broken bones or welts showing up very clearly in a hospital environment under examination with photographs taken, undeniable photographs. Well, what then, I ask? For when it comes to child abuse then, say, or emotional distress from a battlefield, it tends to be that a person is either given compensation or no compensation. They're either a victim or not a victim, as opposed to being an 80% victim or, say, a 50-50 victim, and then a payout made accordingly. They are, again, I would say, either deemed a clear-cut 100% victim or it is left murky And when it comes to a payout in a court of law, there is no payout of a partial nature for murkiness when it comes to emotional distress from a parent or, say, certain elements in society or on the battlefield. This then applying to the Native American Indians' plight, where there is no partial payment made to them for this happening. It's deemed an all-or-nothing situation when it comes to a payout. Again, contrary to what happens in auto accidents, which I would just say at this point is very interesting. Now, I'm trying to remember the name of a man who, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, in the Southwest, I believe, received a gunshot to the head. He may have been a politician or someone else of some notoriety in public, and at any rate, he received a lot of sympathy. And it was said, of course, it was a crime committed, and he was a victim of a crime. But the point being that he was suffering both physical and emotional suffering, and there was no question but that it was 100% someone else's fault. It was never said that he had a genetic component or biochemical component, or that he was oversensitive, and that any one of these three was making him overblow the physical and emotional pain he had received. And so once again, this blow to the head by gunshot being equivalent, I would say, to a child receiving welts from a strapping, or broken bones from being kicked down the stairs, or from being beaten, just plain beaten. There being no question involved. But to risk again being too repetitive, I would say that in cases of ambiguity, where someone in a court of law can claim there's a genetic or biochemical part involved, or oversensitiveness, say, for whatever reason, maybe so-called biochemical or genetic, well, there being no partial payment allowed. So, not only is then the person who is raped, say, oftentimes dragged through the courts and told they were asking for it, or dressed inappropriately, somehow wanted it and brought it on, they have not only this to fight off, but also the question of whether they are overreacting to it emotionally, and whether they should just drive on and put it in the past, issue forgiveness, so to speak, and quit being a victim, having a victim mentality. Just get over it, like a lot of people might, some would say. What are you making such a big deal over it for? You must have a genetic or biochemical component, or in general, you're too oversensitive about having been raped, and thus you're making a big deal out of nothing, and you don't deserve any compensation of any sort then. Arguably, you're simply oversensitive. So this is the first point then that I would make, is that anyone who has suffered almost any kind of trauma, unless it's a gunshot to the wound or broken bones, is probably going to face accusations that they're oversensitive, and that this comes perhaps from a biochemical or genetic issue. And these types of things being rather unprovable one way or the other, whether a genetic condition or biochemical condition exists or not. Nobody yet having been able to demonstrate either in a test tube or with computer studies for genetic examinations. So I would say this then is one of the biggest problems for those who have arguably suffered abuse of some sort, distress, call it, above and beyond the average, say. Or at any rate, they are clearly suffering emotionally. Well, the person then, I would say, is going to struggle perhaps for the rest of their lives, trying to figure out what portion is due to them versus someone else having impacted them. How oversensitive, so to speak, were they in fact? Are they blowing things out of proportion from a so-called genetic or biochemical process involved, as is claimed these days by all psychologists and all psychiatrists, I would say, except for very small proportions saying otherwise. This person then left in murky land, as I would call it, not knowing what happened to them and probably wanting to assess some blame somewhere, trying to make sense of this anyway so they can move on at least, even if they don't want to hang this on someone. Maybe they'd rather hang it on themselves if they could. Maybe they would want to say it was all their fault, their suffering emotionally, and that it was all due to oversensitiveness. If they could come even to that conclusion, maybe then they could move on too. But no, I would say most trauma victims of a sort are left in murky land, as I call it, for the rest of their lives, arguably, and always seeking validation from various sources as to what happened to them, trying to make sense of this, and thus being called people who can't let go of their trauma, that they're playing the victim card and enjoy being the victim. When in fact I would say that isn't at all the case usually. They're simply trying to get to the bottom of things as to the proportionality of what happened. It not being perhaps an all or nothing things in all cases, but they're wanting to understand it more clearly, and there being no definitive answers, no test tube studies, no computer genetic mapping yet to say the component, the degree to which the people essentially were oversensitive compared to some others. So then I would say this is the first and major quandary. But there are some who have talked, say especially in circles concerning PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that say women do tend to suffer more incidence-wise, proportionality-wise from PTSD as opposed to men. And I believe it was Dr. Goulson who said in PTSD for Dummies, as part of the So-and-so for Dummies series books, that in his opinion, women had more incidence of PTSD than men because they're smaller, say bodily size, and I would say too have less muscularity. And in either case, unable thus to defend themselves as well as a man can. And this is corroborated in my mind too by George Carlin, who in at least one video on women and what they have to endure in life compared to men, George Carlin having said that if women had been stronger than men, it would be the men who are getting slapped around and suffering a lot more emotionally. But that George Carlin is saying too that women are essentially more frail, more weak, less able to defend themselves. And so that this is why I would say this PTSD phenomenon is in essence a bigger part of why some feel trauma tremendously from certain events, whether a battlefield or childhood or something happening in society in general, and other people seemingly coming out the other end unscathed emotionally in terms of suffering, to include depression, outsized amounts of fear, terror feelings, even suicidal ideations. But now, here is also where I would add my 2 cents worth in, some of this having been covered by other sources, including George Carlin. But at any rate, I would bring these factors up too, as playing a major role, in my opinion, as to why some seem to suffer or do suffer emotionally a lot more from trauma sources than others. And I'm then talking matters more than just the ability to defend yourself with a large body size or muscles. Oh, first of all, what if a person is not a woman, say, but a man who is an ectomorph, very tall, thin, with no muscles again, say, so to speak? Do you think this person is going to be able to defend themselves very well from any source of trauma, including bullying in childhood, or even some kind of abuse by a parent? Whereby, if the child, say, were a strapping youth, the parent might fear that the strapping youth might beat the parent to a pulp one day when the child might go off in a rage. But I would say no parent is going to fear hurting a ectomorphic, tall, frail child, because the parent knows that the frail child is not going to, so to speak, whoop on the parent and get back physically. Unless, of course, we're talking the frail child completely flipping out and, say, lighting a match to the house and burning the house and everyone in it to the ground. And then I think the parents would be concerned of retribution, but not from getting punched back, so to speak, by a frail, tall child. They're more worried about getting that kind of treatment from a football player type child, a strapping fellow of 5'6", who weighs 200 pounds or more, and could beat the pulp out of anybody. Now, another factor involved, and George Carlin brought this up too, and many women have in advocacy for women, and that is the economic disadvantage. Once again, talking a power disadvantage. In my book, then, my opinion, those who are the most emotionally distressed from any kind of source of trauma typically are those who cannot fight back, so to speak, to prevent further instances, say, if not even getting retribution, which might make them feel better too. At any rate, that it's acknowledged widely these days that women have long had less economic power, less ability to earn a living, and therefore have to take it, so to speak, from their husbands or other people, let's say even on the street or in a city. And hence why, say, after being raped, a woman might want to get taekwondo training or karate training to even this out, to even out their lack of muscles and large body size. And furthermore, the general inability to carry a weapon, especially unconcealed, in full view of every man, woman, and child as they walk down the street 24/7, 365. And that barring this, they don't have the equivalent, which is a strappingly large body size with a lot of muscles. Now, yet another factor, I would say, that predisposes some to what you might call on the surface oversensitivity to trauma is that some people are more kind, more empathetic. Again, arguably this coming more in terms of women, but perhaps in some men too, whereby the ectomorph arguably has less testosterone than a strapping football player type mesomorphic, medium-sized build man with lots of muscles. Such a latter type man, I would say, has more testosterone, more aggression inbuilt, and that when abused by any source, challenged by any source, they can muster this high level of aggression inbuilt to defend themselves, and thus whenever they are injured by bullying, say, it maybe is not very distressing comparatively because they know they can stop it the next time by simply ramping up their inborn aggressive tendencies that some people, say, like ectomorphs, don't have. Now, you might say also, there's a third type of person very subject to not being able to defend themselves well, and thus some would say react with emotional distress in a oversensitive manner. Some would say that is the short person. I've heard from several sources that short people can feel very distressed also about their shortness. I would say, too, even perhaps an obese child can't defend themselves very well either, say in a fist fight even. And once again, all these cases then having an element of a lack of power, and there being a power imbalance, whereby they then can't defend themselves. Whether we're talking defense against something physically or sexually, or even if they're being neglected, ramping up an aggressive counter-response, at least verbally, to get better treatment in terms of food, and maybe even some treatment in terms of better treatment in terms of time spent with the child. Finally, it comes to my attention that some people are simply more sensitive or empathetic, shall we say, and thus arguably less aggressive tendency in general, by way of how they were raised. Let's say maybe they were raised considerably more lovingly than most. Maybe they were raised by their grandmother in a very loving manner instead of the opposite, perhaps, a very stressed out parent of 20. Or maybe also arguably put in daycare very early in life too, and not a very auspicious daycare at that. In all these cases then, I would say the child could be deemed to be oversensitive to arguably trauma or distress, and not being called then a victim of trauma, but oversensitive, and not accorded sympathy, say, that some other people would get otherwise, of a more clear-cut nature, where it would never be accused of anyone, say once again that they're oversensitive for complaining of pain from a gunshot wound. Or shall we say, too, that if a woman is raped as a teenager and becomes pregnant, who is going to say that she's being oversensitive for being expected to raise the child later? That would be kind of a cockeyed accusation, wouldn't it? And she would definitely be incurring some degree of sympathy for not just being raped, but having to have a child and raise it if she didn't want to give it up for adoption. But barring again these certain circumstances, a lot of people then being accused of being oversensitive. And arguably that a psychiatrist or psychologist would say it's largely because of genetics or biochemistry, if in fact they're not saying one and the same is occurring at the same time. Indeed, a father who administers punishment to a child and the child later has to suffer emotionally and go to therapy for the rest of their lives, well, the parent might want to maintain that the child is simply oversensitive or a wimp or a wuss, so to speak, trying to wiggle out of this perhaps. I would even say that some children are more sensitive than others because they may be children of immigrants or immigrants themselves, and maybe the culture they came from was much less violent-natured, much less aggressive than the one they find themselves now in. And thus, they're not being more oversensitive per se. They're simply not having the level of aggression found on average in the culture they're now in, and thus unable to defend themselves with acts of a counter-aggression or simply getting angry, furious, say. And thus, once again, there being a power imbalance because they can't muster anger or aggression to protect themselves. Now, I don't think I'm making this up for a number of reasons, but for instance, there was a famed psychoanalyst once in the 70s, 80s, perhaps 90s, Rollo May. And he said at one point in a book, The Courage to Create, that Americans are 3 to 10 times as violent as people in Europe. So if, say, a European child or a child of parents who came from Europe were to find themselves in a culture called America, and perhaps in a ghetto or rough neighborhood, well, what then? Perhaps the child is not oversensitive when they're bullied, so much as they're finding themselves in a culture much more aggressive, even violent, than where they came from. And again, then, who is to say whether the child experiencing distress emotionally from bullying, if they are in fact an immigrant child or child of a parent of an immigrant, whether this is oversensitivity or not? Of course, yet another component, then, I would say, allied to this is that if a child happens to be more kind, more gentle, say, for whatever reason, maybe even their grandmother raised them very lovingly, well, then I would bring up this, that if this is something of an anomaly, not so common, maybe this child is not going to be having many allies, finding many allies, many friends. They might find it hard to have a friend in a culture that is much more aggressive in general than they are. Hence, in the movie About a Boy, starring Hugh Grant amongst others, there being an incident where the young boy is suffering tremendously from bullying. And the boy has no friends really in school. And so the question is then, is the boy suffering emotional distress from bullying because he's oversensitive, or is it because largely he has no allies to help, say, with a pack to counterattack another pack of bullies? Whereby, arguably, one boy against 5 is no match. There's no fair fight involved, especially if the boy is not allowed by school or government officials to carry weapons, even a baseball bat. Now, at this point, I would bring up something I think that might be a little out of the box thinking especially, but bear with me, there may be some merit to this, you might say, if you consider this. For what about this concept that, at least in America, if one is convicted of a crime and one goes to prison, the punishment is, in my opinion, typically very, very harsh, no matter what a person has done. Say, it's no surprise that to anybody that if you are convicted of a drug charge and go to prison, that you're not going to get a little slap on the wrist, but something very severe. Case in point, I've bought several books in the last year by Michael Santos, who was convicted, I believe, at age 20 of cocaine sales, and he went to prison for some 27 years and then finally came out. But you might say then, how unfair to be punished for some kind of indiscretion, especially at age 20, with what you might call draconian sentencing. Of course, this not being just a 27-year prison sentence, but we're talking gang warfare in prisons too. We're talking overcrowding. We're talking bullying from prison officials, tearing down of self-esteem all around. We're talking about stress to such proportions that many of the prisoners are probably drugged so that they don't jump over the railings, so to speak, and commit suicide on the spot. Of course, there are suicides, in fact, from people matriculating into prison, say, in the first 48 hours. There are instances in the news of some who go into prison and are immediately so terrified by punishment in the first 48 hours that they hang themselves out of terror. In other words, they're being tortured. in many instances, not just serving a prison sentence. By any way, shape, or form, you could argue it's a form of torture. Now, of course, we can talk all day long about how it could simply be a matter of overcrowding and we don't have enough prison space. But at any rate, this is where I'm going to lead, and that is that I think there's going to be no partial payment, so to speak, or partial acknowledgement of child abuse or any other form of victimization or harm if the sentence that would be accorded, even a partial payout, were a prison term and not just a slap on the wrist, say, in terms of losing your child in a custody suit or having your child taken away from you by Child Protective Services. If a father, for instance, were routinely sent to prison for neglect or hitting a child, well, I suppose there would not only be an uproar, but there would be a very robust discussion over whether the punishment doesn't fit the crime, whether it's excessive. We would say, on the one hand, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime when it comes to drugs or burglaries, but what about child abuse or abuse in society in general, even from some white-collar criminality? What then? Who goes to prison then and suffers overcrowding and abuse from guards and stress from gangs, which they're expected, by the way, to join? I would say this is a major stickler then in why almost no parent is going to admit to a child that they had abused the child and that, yes, they're sorry. And please forgive me, because under a court of law, if they had in fact admitted guilt, maybe they had done something far worse than a simple cocaine violation, law violation, and ought to get 10 times the treatment in prison what a drug offense gets. And so who in their right mind is going to admit they ever abused their child? Because the sentencing would be so draconian. And I'm not even talking then of the after effects after getting out of prison, if at all. Say, the stigma against, quote, ex-convicts so strong, they're lucky to get a bagging job at the local grocery store or sweep the streets. And the best they can hope for is to go on disability and keep their head low. And finally, but not least, I would say that if child abuse or any other kind of distress suffered unfairly routinely ended up in a court of law with a therapist or psychiatrist by the injured person's side testifying on their behalf, that this psychiatrist or psychologist would be so stressed out from constant court appearances whereby the parent or other party would vociferously, angrily deny charges and even attack the credibility and otherwise of the therapist or analyst, or rather psychiatrist, to the point that the practitioner trying to come to the aid of the victimized person would soon be taking tranquilizers and seeing a therapist themselves, and soon be declared perhaps mentally ill themselves, out of stress. In fact, I would say perhaps part of the reason why therapists and psychiatrists tend to lock their office doors, except upon admitting a patient at such and such a time, is either to block violent activity from a client or patient, but also from any public figure who has once been accused of abusing a child or other patient, say, and wanting retribution for being accused of this in a court of law. And then this being the rub, I would say, too, that maybe some therapists go into this profession, maybe even some psychiatrists, with a partial, at least, desire to help those who have suffered for whatever reason, and then once they hit the street as a practitioner, may soon discover a tremendous amount of distress due to either violence, abuse, oppression, whatever. And then the question is, in their mind, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to go to bat for my client and have to do this rather routinely, maybe even daily court appearances? Am I going to suffer all the distress and come home and have to drink and take tranquilizers and be a mean husband to my wife and children? Or am I going to have to sweep all this under the rug and declare that my clients have a genetic and biochemical component so that I don't have to appear in court every day or every other day and go through this horrific counterattack on the defense chair, so to speak, and come home all stressed out totally. And maybe even have to change careers in a year or two, all burnt out. They have a quick decision, I would say, to make. Am I going to go to bat for my clients, my patients, or am I going to self-preserve and make the best of this muck? Which isn't to say, by the way, that many of them don't get out of the profession entirely in time, out of the stress and frustration. I know this to be true. I was told this once by a practitioner, that many flee their field, abandon it. And the person once having told me it was financially related in part, but maybe it's much more than the finances, and maybe it's just simply the stress of wanting to help clients sometimes, but if they put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, in a court of law, they would be so stressed out. They would be taking Valium the next day and for the rest of their lives, and soon be psychiatric patients themselves, perhaps even in mental hospitals, so to speak. What practitioner wants this? No, I'm afraid it's pretty much a no-brainer in my mind that they're going to do as is being done, and that they're going to waffle and say that there's a big or questionable genetic and biochemical issue involved, and therefore I'm not going to appear in court and help defend clients on that basis because it's too murky and I would never win in a court of law. And thus basically self-preserving the sanity and the marriage, everything, the physical and emotional health of the practitioner. This is what I would call, in essence, a dirty little secret that probably every therapist soon encounters and has to deal with, and every psychiatrist too. And it not being a pretty picture, in fact, they've invested a couple $100,000 in student loans to acquire the license to be a practitioner in the first place. And that if they gave it all up, they might be bagging groceries at the local grocery store or flipping hamburgers at the local fast food place. They have kind of a draconian all-or-nothing option here, and guess what the sane person probably would choose, barring getting out of the profession entirely, which, by the way, might garner them a divorce from their spouse due to lost income all of a sudden, where these days divorces are very easy to come by, and maybe the spouse deeming that life is short, I'm not going to put up with this loss of income, and I'm going to try again and find a partner who is not going to be flipping hamburgers 2 months from now. So then, isn't this kind of an interesting situation that maybe an insurance adjuster, when we're dealing with auto accidents, has much more liberty, much more freedom to accord partial responsibility and partial liability financially for a accident. Or you might call victimization, if you will, abuse, so to speak, by auto. But when it comes to adjudication in a court of law, the compensation deemed necessary from a partially guilty party being financial in nature and rarely a prison appearance, prison time. This prison issue being related more toward abuse, physically, sexually, or in terms of neglect, and maybe by oppression from some sources in society in general. So then, perhaps in my mind, this is the crux of why there is no partial accountability assessed to child abuse or some other sources. It's because the punishment involved would not be a financial remuneration to the abused victim, but instead prison time. And prison time being draconian, not only the time in prison, but time afterward, simply by being labeled an ex-con. Your life basically over, and perhaps some ex-cons then committing suicide. In other words, in today's parlance, taking a drug overdose. A life being simply too hard under the stigmatized conditions, where no matter even if you tried your hardest to turn a new leaf and did it, that you're probably not going to get a fair shake ever again. This then, all of this, I believe, is why it is so hard for someone who has suffered trauma to, first of all, know it to some degree, and to stop, quote, playing the victim card, constantly trying to get validation or clarification, moreover, as I would put it, as to what in the world happened to me. And it not helping anyone that when they ask for some assistance from a therapist, they will immediately be called mentally ill and stigmatized. And therefore they have double trouble now, not only wondering whether they were ever victimized in the first place, but secondarily now having to struggle with stigma over being called mentally ill. And not only, quote, mentally ill, of a sort where, say, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual could say you're mentally ill for being obese, having a substance abuse disorder called food, but you're being termed perhaps seriously mentally ill, where some would say you could be a possible danger to society, regardless of your good character and high empathy level. So once again, to reiterate once again, the typical traumatized person from childhood or some other sources not being able to get to the bottom of what happened, but also being stigmatized, and this having far-reaching implications, even to the point of their having guilt feelings, wondering whether or not it is true when some people accuse them of being a danger. This then is why, once again, I would say it is very hard to overcome trauma if it is not extremely clear-cut, like broken bones, welts that are photographable by a forensic doctor, or finally a gunshot wound, especially to the head. That all of this being extremely difficult to deal with, and the person typically never getting to the bottom of this till the day they die. Always seeking, once again, validation, but I don't mean validation so much as clarification of what has happened and how to deal with the stigma. Perhaps at some future point I will talk about my views on how to overcome this kind of situation. I do believe it is overcomeable, but that this can't happen overnight and requires certain guidance by very savvy practitioners or friends or relatives, and Perhaps I'll address my ideas on this at a future point, not too far along from now. But I would say that this then is the crux of why some people say, oh, you're simply playing the victim card, why don't you just let it go and move on? It's all too murky to let it go on, to put it in the past if you don't know to what degree you are a victim or not. Especially, once again, if you're called oversensitive. Due to biochemical or genetic issues, it's maintained to some degree. I will say at the end of this, as I usually do, I wish you well. And if you have suffered from whatever source, or feel you have, I would urge you to find someone, if possible, not who is just simply an average therapist, but someone dealing with trauma situations on a routine basis. Perhaps not to the point where they go to bat for their clients all the time in the court of law, but have an intimate, personal understanding from their own life of what trauma is all about. And that it's very complex. Once again, I wish you a good day.